Morning, everyone. Well, good morning to all colleagues from the region who are tuning in to this ICPVTR seminar at RSIS in Singapore. And good afternoon or good evening to our prominent speaker, Dr. Matt Levitt, who is dialing in from Washington, DC, and has given up his evening to join us and talk about his latest report. We've got a pretty good turnout so far. And I think we'll have a few more people probably coming in as we get ourselves going. But I will start our introductions and get us going with this morning's session. So good morning. My name is Raffaello Pantucci. I'm a senior fellow at the International Center for the Study of Political Violence for Research, the Center for Political Terrorism and Violence Research. And I apologize, it's a very long acronym and I'm still getting accustomed to. At the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies here in Singapore at the Nanyang Technological University. And I'm delighted to welcome you all today for this morning webinar we have looking at 2 decades on from 9/11, rethinking US efforts on counterterrorism. And we're joined this morning by a wonderful speaker, Dr. Matt Levitt, who is the Fromer Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute and director of its Jeanette and Eli Reinhardt program on counterterrorism and intelligence. Prior to that, he served at the US Department of Treasury as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis. And he also served some time in the intelligence community in the United States, working for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as well as I think for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He is a widely published expert and academic who has written extensively on threats to the US from various terrorist groups. Most prominently, he's written a number of books on Hezbollah, and he has worked on these issues around counterterrorism questions for many, many years. And we're here today because Matt recently wrote a really interesting article, or a memo really, or report for his think tank, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, called Rethinking US Efforts on Counterterrorism Towards a Sustainable Plan 2 Decades On from 9/11. And this report landed a couple of months ago. And it landed sort of just before the US President Biden made the announcement earlier last week that the US is going to be withdrawing from Afghanistan at the end of this year. In fact, time to coincide with the 2nd decade anniversary since the attacks of 9/11. And so this, we set this event up prior to that announcement by the president, but the announcement by the president gives us a kind of perfect hook for this discussion, which is to try to understand what exactly has happened within the US counterterrorism structures and system since 9/11. We've been 2 decades on from that momentous attack that killed many thousands in the United States and really set us on a path for a kind of 2-decade-long conflict that we're still involved in. Well, in Afghanistan, we'll be out of it this year. But if we look at the other places around the world, we look at the rise of groups like ISIS, we look at the rise of various Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliates around the world, we can see there's been a huge transformation in the sort of terrorist threat picture to the United States, but to the world. Vast sums of money have been spent by governments to try to counter and manage this threat. And now 2 decades on, however, the discourse seems to have shifted. And now we're talking much more about extreme right-wing threats. And we remember the events in Capitol Hill earlier this year as another seeming shock event, which has maybe triggered a new thinking or change within the kind of US counterterrorism system. And then because of its kind of sheer size and volume, that probably has that does have echoes all over the world. And so I think the real questions that we want to try to dig into this morning was to try to get a sense from Matt about where it was that the expectations in Washington about where the future threats were going. How does this fit into the kind of overriding discussion we now see coming out of Washington of interstate conflict as the driving national security question that the US is preoccupied with? And what lessons have been learned and what's actually been sort of achieved over these 2 decades? We haven't seen any attacks on the scale of 9/11 in the United States since then, but we've seen attacks around the world. And according to some metrics, the problems and threats from Al-Qaeda and ISIS have actually multiplied. So to answer all of these complicated questions, we're really delighted and honored that Matt is able to join us this evening, his time, to talk about this. Matt will talk to us for, I think, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, half an hour to get us going. And then we've got a good amount of time afterwards for questions and discussion. As is the standard practice with our webinars here at ICPVTR, please put your questions into the chat box and I'll monitor them and then put them to Matt as we get towards the end of his presentation. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Matt, and thank you once again for giving up your evening to talk to us here in Singapore. Over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to do this webinar with you. Among other things in my bio, I'm very proud of the fact that when ICPVTR was starting off, I had the opportunity to serve on its advisory board. And now to be able to appear at a webinar with you all is really very gratifying. I won't lie to you, Raf is also an old friend, and so it's a pleasure to be able to do this together with him. Thank you, Raf, and thank you everyone at the program. So the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where I direct the Counterterrorism and Intelligence Program, is a nonpartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., focused on U.S. policy towards the greater Middle East. And while we're nonpartisan, every 4 years we do these bipartisan presidential study reports, so that the idea is whoever next occupies the White House, they'll have some hopefully, well thought out, well researched bipartisan ideas on some difficult problems. Given our area of expertise, that will include Israeli-Palestinian conflict, negotiations with Iran, a whole host of other issues. And I've been writing our transition papers on counterterrorism issues. The last 3 presidential cycles, we focused very much on issues relating to countering violent extremism. And this time around, given that it's about to be the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we decided to take a big step back and do a big think piece on what US counterterrorism should look like 20 years after 9/11. I have to say, for me, this was a strange thing to do because, in part, I worked 9/11. As Raf said, I worked at the FBI when I started my career here in Washington, D.C. I was a counterterrorism analyst at the FBI, and I led the analytical team on the flight team for Flight 175. So to come 20 years later, first of all, to realize it's been 20 years. And second, to be thinking, where have we gotten and how should we change? It was kind of a, it was a big moment, at least for me, in terms of my career path. So, here in the United States, things are pretty politically divided, but there's a few areas where there's some consistency. And one of them, surprisingly enough, is in general terms on a desire to end massive US military deployments. Some people refer to these as endless wars or forever wars. They're not necessarily always clear on what is and what isn't a forever war. I would argue, for example, that the US-led deployment in Syria is small, it's fairly inexpensive, it's fairly safe, it's having outsized positive effects. It's probably the opposite of an endless war. Iraq, Afghanistan, clearly these very long deployments. I think some people forget that the largest US deployments, and by far the longest US deployments, are not in the Middle East at all. They're on the Korean Peninsula, they're in Germany, they're in Japan. But if you look at the US system, there is consistency on the issue of making that footprint smaller and of making the counterterrorism mission more sustainable. The aha moment here is that there are 2 things that are going on. One is the amount of money that the United States government is spending every year on counterterrorism focused missions, primarily military, but not only, is just gargantuan, and it is not sustainable. Not when we have so many other issues that require our time, our attention, our people power, and our dollars. That goes from the environment to infrastructure, to domestic extremism, COVID, the rebuilding our economies because of COVID, all these different things. The second thing is that we not only have multiple issues that are demanding those resources, we have other threats that we need to deal with. And in particular, there's an awakening to the reality that certainly for the United States, terrorism is not an existential threat. 9/11 was horrific. It'll scar those of us who lived through it for forever. But we've had days where we've lost more people to COVID than we lost on 9/11. And that sometimes is kind of recurring, much larger numbers. And we're realizing that in terms of core US strategic threats, there are other things, in particular, interstate competition or great power competition combined with kind of regional power competition that are going to demand more of our focus. So during the Trump administration, there were a series of national security strategy reports that were released, as there are under every US administration. But here there was a little bit of a disconnect. If you read the counterterrorism strategy, bless you, Raf, which is still available on the website, you see that it talks about ending terrorism, which I thought was terrible. We're never going to end terrorism. Terrorism is a form of interstate, interpersonal conflict. People are going to get angry at each other. What we want to do is not end terrorism, no more than police are out there to end crime. We want to get terrorism into a tolerable threshold where it is primarily a law enforcement problem and not a primary national or international security concern. But if you looked at the national security strategy, because it's about all national security, it was also very broad. But if you then looked at the national defense strategy, you saw something very different, where the national defense strategy said, no, now there are 5 top national security concerns. Counterterrorism is one of those 5, but it's number 5. It's not the first, second, third, or fourth. It's the 5th of our top national security priorities. And what are the top 4? Interstate competition: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. So kind of a great power and then regional power competition. Now, it's not just that there was this disconnect between the strategies. The way things work in the United States is that the national defense strategy drives the military, and the military is what is fighting the counterterrorism effort around the world. The military also houses, controls, is part of the intelligence community, is part of the military. Of about 80% of the US intelligence community is kind of resident within some part of the military, including things like the NSA for SIGINT, signals intelligence. So when the national defense strategy goes in a new direction, that kind of swings the whole system and the tail ends up following. And so it really forced people to think through, well, what do we need and how do we do it? So the case for a counterterrorism review that was rationalizing the counterterrorism mission so that we could do the other things we need to do and making it more sustainable over the long term. At a time of shrinking budgets and of growing deficits here in the United States, this is something that resonates with politicians across the political aisle. And then when you had COVID-19 on top of it, you know, there's a lot of competition for limited dollars right now. What people have realized, however, is that we want to rationalize counterterrorism. We want to make it more sustainable, but we also don't want to be at risk. We don't want to lose the gains that we have developed over the past 20 years. The United States, by virtue of spending so much money, has developed incredible capabilities to find, fix, and finish people who are wishing to do us harm. We have developed second to none intelligence capabilities, communications capabilities, the ability to cycle through collecting information, making sense of that information, letting that information lead to the next raid so quickly, especially on the ground in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, that you want to be careful not to lose that advantage. We also have to recognize that our adversaries get a vote. We can decide, listen, we've had enough with Afghanistan. Taliban may decide that it doesn't want to stop being extremists and it doesn't want to stop harboring Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda may decide that it doesn't, that it still wants to target the United States and the international community. So our adversaries have a say in all of this. So the question is, how do you do it? What's the big idea here, and how do you do it? So the big idea is the following few baskets. The first is that these are not mutually exclusive efforts. Great power competition, counterterrorism, there's actually a tremendous Venn diagram of overlap between the two, but you got to be smart about it. So during the Trump administration, at one point, the government decided that they were going to withdraw a significant percentage of AFRICOM forces, U.S. forces in Africa, because they wanted to move them elsewhere, primarily to Asia, for great power competition. But it made no sense because there were already quite few forces in Africa. You weren't going to save a whole lot to move to Asia. And those forces in Africa were doing things that were effective in great power competition. And nobody denies that Africa is a tremendous venue of great power competition, particularly with China. Many countries in Africa, what they want is counterterrorism support. Helping them with counterterrorism gives us currency that we can cash in not only on counterterrorism issues, but on great power issues. So figuring out how to leverage different levers of influence is really important, as opposed to thinking about these in silos, because they're not in silos. They should be strategically reinforcing, we should not be thinking about them as being mutually exclusive. The second thing that we need to think about is that we need to stop thinking about counterterrorism in kind of binary Cold War terms of victory or defeat. I've testified before Congress many times, and I've annoyed many members when they've asked me, so when do you think the war on terrorism will end? It's one of the many reasons why the term war on terrorism is not a great term. And my answer is, well, it's not going to end as such. They don't like that. Wars need to have exit strategies, right? Wars need to end. Well, we need to stop thinking about counterterrorism in these binary Cold War terms, and we need to think of it in other terms. We need to think of it as something that will require an ongoing effort, but one that will be short of war, even as it is also short of peace. Again, crime continues, right? Narcotic smuggling continues. Money laundering continues. But we do what we can to control those problem sets. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about the war on money laundering and the war on drugs and but that thinking about it that way is just not useful. And if you don't, then you can say to yourself, so what is the mission, for example, in Syria all about? What counterterrorism or other missions is it doing? And you can assess whether it's still worth doing, even if it's multiple years out. If you're not doing state building, for example, as we ended up by default in Afghanistan and Iraq, not doing very well. We've been really great at what I describe as tactical counterterrorism, that find, fix, finish, preventing plots, never stopping all of them, but really doing a great job at tactical counterterrorism. But we've been much less successful at what I describe as strategic counterterrorism, which is about really disrupting the radicalization process, which has as much to do with local grievances and poor governance and corruption as it does with ideology. In my case, every time someone gets radicalized, there's some type of local or international personal grievance or grievance for someone you feel affiliated with around the world. But there's also ends up being some element of ideology. Something has to mobilize you to act on that grievance. And we have to do much better at that. The big idea here, in order to do this for the US, is to flip the model that we have developed over the past few years. The model we've developed is trying to get others to fight with us in what we've described as a US-led, partner-enabled model. We want people to join us. We'll take lead, but we want to be enabled by our partners. The new idea is to flip that on its head. Now, if there's a place where there is a threat to the US homeland, US will take the lead. If there's a threat to close partners that we can play a close role in, sure. But in general, the US no longer wants to be a policeman all over the world. So what we're going to be looking at now, and what there's great consensus for, and what the Biden administration already seems to be looking towards, is a flip of that model where, whenever possible, it will be partner-led and US-enabled. That US-enabled is important. if you look at Operation Barkhane in the Sahel, French-led, multiple European partners, 5 key Sahel states involved. A little hiccup right now in terms of what's going on in Mali, but probably, hopefully, just a hiccup, maybe. They are able to do what they're able to do. The French will say it first, and you don't need to take my word for it, only because of certain types of support they get from the United States. ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, mid-air refueling, and various types of logistics are probably the top 3 most important things for them. And nobody else in the world has developed the ability to do it the way that the US has done it, because no one's invested the money that we have. We're going to need to be able to be there to provide key support to our allies, especially among those things that are unique to our capabilities. But this idea of getting allies to do more, whether it's in the context of NATO or otherwise, whether it's a percentage of GDP or whatever, that idea is going to become very, very tangible as the US says, well, Mali isn't necessarily a key US interest. We don't see people trying to carry out attacks on the homeland from there. So we'll help you, but you got to leave. Now, in order to do that, you have to develop, maintain, and then even develop further your intelligence capabilities. Because the whole idea is, I'm not going to be there, but I'm going to have my forecasting, indicators, and warning so sensitive that I'll be able to see if something changes. And we have to recognize as Americans, for all of the capabilities of our intelligence service, we've missed the ball on this several times. Right? The U.S. intelligence community is quite sure that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was a regional threat until AQAP started trying to carry out attacks against the homeland, the underwear bomber, the toner cartridge plot, etc. Same with Al-Shabaab. Same with ISIS, famously described as the JV, meaning the junior varsity terrorist group compared to Al-Qaeda, just as the group was on the threshold of taking over a swath of the Middle East the size of Great Britain. So the problem here is that it's going to be very, very hard to maintain the level of intelligence collection and understanding that we have today, let alone make it better when we withdraw from certain places. Because the reality is, if you're not on the ground, you're not running human sources the same way. If you're not on the ground, you don't have bases from which to launch drones from nearby so they can circulate for longer. For that matter, the reality is that the way US budgets for counterterrorism have been built quickly over 20 years is by kind of latching them onto military budgets. So if you move all your military, for example, out of Afghanistan, you can't assume that you're only moving the drones with warheads and you're keeping the drones with sensors, right? The budgets for all those drones are going to be gone if the US doesn't find a way to disentangle these budgets. And believe me, as someone who was the deputy chief of one of our intelligence agencies once upon a time, that's a nightmare. That's just very, very complicated. To do this, we're going to have to do 3 things. One of them is disentangle these budgets, and I'm not going to bore you with that. It's a very kind of domestic US bureaucracy thing, but it's critically important. We're going to have to do 2 other things, and then I'm going to wrap up in a second so we can have a discussion about this. The first is we're going to have to recognize, and I don't say this as a partisan statement. I can be critical, and I have been critical of the Obama administration. I'm sure there are things I'll be critical about. I'm sorry, with the Obama administration, I'm sure there are things I'll be critical about with the Biden administration. But the reality is that the Trump administration did things differently, and it had a negative impact with some of our key allies. You could make the argument that Obama isolated and upset other allies, some of our allies in the Gulf, for example. But under President Trump, we didn't give key allies that were deployed on the ground with us, for example, in Syria, any heads up that the president was going to tweet, "Good morning, how are you? We're out of Syria." And I was in the capital of a major European country, major US partner, that December when the president first tweeted that. I was meeting with their counterterrorism officials, They were shocked. They were beside themselves, trying to make sure that their people were safe because they're able to deploy out there because of the certain capabilities that the US brings. If the US is going to leave all of a sudden, what are they going to do? You can't ask partners to lead, partner-led and US-enabled, if those partners don't think that you are going to stick with it, that you are going to be a reliable partner, continuing to enable them for the duration of the mission. You could argue there's a bigger problem that, you know, the US of the 4-year US election cycle, right? These things take more than 4 years. That's another level to the problem. But even on a shorter term, we are going to have to spend time talking with our allies, starting by asking them how they perceive, how you perceive problem X, Y, and Z. How critical is this threat to you? What are the top threats for you? And then you and I can have a conversation about this, which is not how we typically do things, but it is how we're going to have to do things. And I've written a couple of more articles about that since the paper came out. The second is I really do think that once we disentangle these budgets and we're able to maintain the platforms and the capabilities that enable us to collect, analyze, and make sense of information in a timely manner, we're still going to need to invest significantly with some upfront significant investment in modernization for the US intelligence community, in particular investing in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and in the hardware necessary to be able to support those types of tools. We just had a US government funded commission looking into artificial intelligence. And I think they kind of hit the nail on the head when they said, listen, if you want to be able to do forecasting, you're really going to have to leverage these tools. Now, you're still going to need a tremendous amount of human input and human oversight. This is not a sci-fi movie where, you know, the computer is going to take over the world, but we are going to have to be able to leverage the ability of sophisticated computers to do things much faster than you or I can, given the nature of our human brains. All of this is massive change for the way the US government operates. And I'll just conclude with this. The reason we need to invest in the intelligence community, not just maintain what we have, which will be hard enough, but invest to do better, is because the US intelligence community is really a little bit scared right now to withdraw forces from a lot of these places. And I don't think we'll be withdrawing forces from Iraq so soon. We're not going to be withdrawing forces from Syria. Afghanistan alone is going to be a very, very big shift for us. But their nightmare scenario is that we withdraw, we rationalize our counterterrorism posture, we make the whole counterterrorism mission set more sustainable. All of that translates into more pressure on the intelligence community to be able to warn you, hey, something's coming around the corner. And what happens, probably not if, but when, because you can never be 100%, they fail. What happens if someone gets on an airplane, and the reason we find out later they're able to get on that airplane to carry out an aviation plot is because some platform is no longer available, and the type of information that it provided helped provide information for our watch listing, and without that watch listing information, the person got on the airplane. Or God forbid, there's an attack on the homeland or US interests abroad that comes from Afghanistan or from ISIS-K in Afghanistan, or Al-Qaeda with some type of Afghanistan connection. You know, there's not going to be a whole lot of understanding for that. So we can all have very rational conversations right now about, well, you know, sustainability, and we have other threats, and what should we be doing? But you can only do that from the comfort of a lack of attacks. The second there's an attack, maybe even one that fails or is thwarted, but certainly, God forbid, one that succeeds, all of the rational thinking goes out the window. And it becomes a very emotional, and to be honest, a very political response, where people aren't going to tolerate, well, yes, but you got to understand. So it's a very, very sensitive moment. And I've had an opportunity to speak with counterterrorism coordinators and people like them from a variety of other countries that are close US partners. And I can tell you that the ideas in this paper, not me or my paper, but the ideas here, which are ideas that the US government's been thinking through for a while now, completely have captured their attention. Because think for a minute about what it means for the US to change the way it does counterterrorism for the UK, for Germany, for France. Go on down the list, and it's by no means limited to Europe, right? It changes everything for everybody. And everyone's trying to think now, so how do I compensate? Where do I compensate? I can't do everything, so who do I partner with? And I'll compensate here and they compensate there. And can I trust others to do what so far we've been able to rely on the United States to do? And I'm sure there's also an element of, can I try and convince the United States not to make so big a shift so quickly? I don't know how quick it's going to be, but the shift is coming because it's simply not financially or politically sustainable anymore. So these are huge ideas. If you look at the Biden administration's interim national security strategic guidance, which is available on the internet, you can see they're already looking in this direction. And I think we're going to see a lot more like it. Now, there are other things we can talk about in the report in terms of, the impact of global fragility and how we should try and get ahead of that curve. We can talk about the impact of, trying to get ahead of radicalization. There are lots of other issues here. How do you measure success? But I'm not here to kind of give you all the points in the report. I'd like you to read it. I put the link in the chat. And B, I really want to have a conversation with you all. And so let me stop here. Let me just thank the program and everyone involved for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to be able to do this. And let's go eagerly to the Q&A.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Matt. That was really a brilliant summary of the sort of horizon, and really kind of lays out, I think, as you pointed out, some really important questions around counterterrorism going forwards, and how we really make sure the lessons and the experiences of the past 20 years are learned, not just sort of, consigned to history. I thought it was quite striking, actually, when, shortly before, I think the announcement in Afghanistan was made, I noticed that the heads of various intelligence agencies were testifying in, I think, the Senate Intelligence Committee, and new CIA Director Bill Burns made a sort of categorical statement about how AQ and ISIS were no longer a threat to the homeland. I think it was a very categorical statement about the nature of the threat that they saw from AQ and ISIS in particular. And that was quite striking because, that's quite a big statement if we think about where we are and what's been the focus of attention of the past 20 years. And maybe I'll start us off by trying to pivot onto that, onto a question. And then I see that my boss Kumar has already put a question in the chat. So I'll come to that one next, if that's okay. But and let me also encourage everyone else, if you have questions you want to ask, please feed them into the chat, and then I'll put them to Matt and try to sort of gather the ones that are close together. But I think the interesting thing about the comment about AQ and ISIS and the change with them was that it comes as, I think there's a general sense that in the US, the discourse around CT, counterterrorism, has shifted to the right. And by that, I don't mean, the sort of conservative, but I mean the extreme right wing seems to be a really driving part of this. And clearly events, I think, in January in Capitol Hill have brought this to the top of the kind of media and political agenda. But, there's been a general sense for a while that, the right wing threat in the US is rising. I can tell you from the UK, where they were very close with the US, of course, on all these sorts of questions, there's been a great sense of agitation about the right wing for some time. It's been rising. Out here in Asia, I can tell you the discourse is definitely rising about worries about the right wing and how it can impact out here and across Europe. And so, there is this kind of thing. And I guess the question I'd ask you is how much, do you see that shift in concern from, AQ ISIS to the extreme right wing driving what you're kind of talking about in terms of reallocation of funds, or how does it echo in that as well? Or are we really talking about two parallel things? One of the really interesting points that you made in your transition memo, which I agree with 100%, is this idea that, counterterrorism operations should be about turning a national security problem into a law enforcement problem. And CT should really be a law enforcement problem on a domestic level, right? And that is important. But I just wonder, how does all of that play in to this shift that we can sort of see, at least at a discourse level, of from AQ ISIS to this kind of right wing? So if you want to start giving us some thoughts about that, and then I'll start collecting some of the questions together. Thank you.
So lots of great stuff there. So first, the paper is primarily about the US military presence, because that's the big cost. And so while I made sure to touch on the domestic terrorism issue because it's so important, that's not primarily what the paper is about. But the point is very, very spot on. Domestic terrorism, whether it's white supremacy, other forms of anti-government behavior, neo-Nazi, in general, right-wing extremism, and it's, by the way, notable transnational links, has become a much, much more acute problem. I think it's critically important to recognize that that is happening at the same time that this other set of issues that I'm describing were going on. And this issue of rationalizing the counterterrorism, the military counterterrorism mission, making it more sustainable, this predates the kind of sharp rise of right-wing extremism that we've seen over the past few years. But it certainly does exacerbate it. Now, what Bill Burns basically said, I didn't hear him say exactly that Al-Qaeda and ISIS aren't threats. What he said is the biggest threats to the homeland are the biggest. This is not saying that they aren't threats, but the biggest threats to the US homeland are from inspired. Not even so much foreign directed, but homegrown violent extremists inspired by the likes of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But he also talked about the fact that if we leave Afghanistan, we are going to lose intelligence, and the likelihood is that the Taliban will take over the country, and there will probably be civil war, and a lot of gains, whether it's in education for women, whatever, are going to be down the toilet. That latter is really the bit that got a lot more attention in the press here, just because of the timing of it all. But I do think that we're going to have to be able to walk and chew gum. The threat from transnational Islamist terrorism is not gone, even as the threat from various types of right-wing extremism is sharply rising, and not only in the United States. It's also the case that they feed off each other, right? Right-wing extremists point in an Islamic phobic type of way to Islamist terrorism to justify some of their activities, and I'm sure that there's an element on the other side as well. We're going to have to be able to shift more dollars to deal with domestic terrorism threat, no question, especially since both for the Biden administration and for the Trump administration, and probably neither administration would like me comparing them being in the same place on any issue, but the fact is, for both, attacks against the homeland and US interests abroad is the big red line. It's no longer all attacks against all people everywhere. It's not that we don't care about that, we absolutely do. And if we have intelligence and we can share and we can do, we will. But we can't be responsible for being the primary go-to for all terrorism everywhere. And so the focus is really going to be on the homeland. By the way, that also has our allies very, very concerned, because we tend to collect more and sometimes better, not always, intelligence on certain types of activities, certain types of places, certain types of groups. And that has benefited a lot of countries far away from the United States. So there's going to be a shift in how that works. And you're absolutely right that the rise of right-wing extremism, which I like to call domestic terrorism, it's not something less than, it's not just extreme, it is terrorism. Let's call it what it is. And I call the January 6th episode an absolute insurrection. Not everybody who was involved was a terrorist by any stretch of the imagination, but it was led by people who were intent on an insurrection. That has focused the attention here like you can imagine, no other event would have. And so, yes, these two things happening in parallel, it's going to be a sea change.
Thank you. I think the point you briefly touched on that, which I'd love to hear a bit more about maybe going on, is how the extreme right-wing terrorist threat intersects with the interstate conflict, because I know that's something we've talked about in particular in a European context, but I think it'd be an interesting one to sort of unpack. But let me turn to the questions, and Kumar has asked a question. In his recent book, former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster suggests that the counterterrorism only mission focus of the US mission to Afghanistan was insufficient. There also needs to be more about Afghan government reform. But in your perspective, after 20 years, is the find, fix, and finish model the easiest, less exhausting, and hence ultimately most sustainable strategy for counterterrorism missions abroad going forwards?
No, absolutely not. It just won't work. It is the hamster running in one of those circular things. So he's running, but he's getting nowhere. At the end, that's the tactical counterterrorism we've got really good at. And the strategic counterterrorism is going to be about getting ahead of some of these underlying issues. We are going to have to think about global fragility. The U.S. government under the Trump administration authored a congressionally mandated report based on the Global Fragility Act, where it talked about the fact, we need to identify places where poor governance, lack of security sector reform, massive corruption, lack of effective ways of addressing grievances, expressing political opinions, where that doesn't exist, people look for other means, right? And how do we go about doing that? Well, the US, I think, has come to the realization that it's not by sending in the military, kicking out the bad guys, and trying to rebuild in our image, right? We are not good at that type of government building. But what we can be better at, especially if we're not trying to do it alone, we're doing it with a lot of international partners, and we're doing it with a lot of non-government international partners. We can try and figure out where we can spend money today to prevent tomorrow's rise in extremism. The biggest problem here is not that we don't know where or what. There's actually a lot of good research, a lot of great academic work. The problem is it's very difficult to convince people who hold the purse strings to spend money today on tomorrow's problem that isn't here yet. It's extremely hard. Now, the report, which again came out under the Trump administration, was very blunt. We can spend money today, a lot less money with much bigger effect. We could save billions of dollars with a B, but we have to spend that money now. And I think one of the big challenges is going to be to convince governments of the need to deal with these issues out of their own self-interest. And that's going to be hard, both because you have some governments that are not structured to be inclusive, democratic. Good governance is not their biggest concern. But even they, I think, are going to have to, I think this is a single generational moment now, not multiple generations, where that type of a model is going to be increasingly untenable because the world is shrinking, and communication, travel, the ability to fund without leaving your mama's basement on a computer, the ability to speak at a seminar in Singapore from Washington, D.C. the night before. I mean, it's a different world. And where we need to really push is, without being there in an occupying way, how do we address global fragility? This, to me, I think is the biggest challenge we have. We've figured out ways to meet our adversaries in the battlefield where necessary, We're figuring out ways to meet them on virtual battlefields even. But what we haven't figured out is how to stop people from wanting to hurt other people in the name of ideology. And we're just beginning to come to terms in government circles and academic circles. It's been this way for a long time already, and understanding that it's not all about ideology. Ideology is a big factor, but it's not all about ideology. And in fact, if you really want to get ahead of the curve, you're primarily not talking about ideology. You're talking about all these sometimes really legitimate grievances that need to be addressed. You know, we just published a paper by Nate Rosenblatt, a young budding scholar about to finish his PhD at Oxford. We just published a study he did on foreign terrorist fighter hubs. He did all this fabulous research, field work. Turns out, if you look at where people were coming to fight for ISIS, they came from hubs, and hubs doesn't mean a country, it doesn't mean a city, it can mean a neighborhood, it can mean a city block. Then you can study why were those places hubs. And if we can learn from that, we can actually try and identify what types of conditions happen there, where also those conditions happening, places we can invest today to try and prevent those other places from being tomorrow's hubs. Because foreign terrorist fighter activity tends to go in waves. We're at an ebb right now, which is great, but that's not the time to look the other way. That's specifically the time to invest and try and fix the problem. So we need to continue with find, fix, and finish, because there's still people who want to do us harm. We need to recognize that sometimes those people look like us, right? As a white American man, right? I will speak for my people, right? We need to understand a lot of the terrorists look like me now, and that might be a lot less comfortable for a lot of Americans. They're going to have to get used to that because our America, our country needs that fix, and frankly, our allies are going to insist on it. You mentioned a minute ago, Raf, that transnational part of this. Right after January 6th, I wrote a piece, and one of the things I argued is, you know, if you look, our allies look at the United States now, and they look at us as an exporter of terrorism, not Islamist terrorism, but of right-wing extremism, because of our freedom of speech rules, because of the nature of what people can do on the web here. And I've compared it, not everybody here has liked it, but after 9/11, the way we went to the Saudis and others and said, yeah, we understand that cracking down on some of these extremists, some of whom are well-connected, is politically, socially, religiously, legally difficult and uncomfortable, and we don't care. It's terrorism, just do it. That's what people are telling us right now, and they're right.
No, I think that's a really interesting point. It's a real twist, I think, on the old model, as you point out. I mean, the one thing I would ask about, because the idea of identifying these hubs and saying, okay, well, if you're going to define what the current ones are, maybe we can look at ones in the future, is, of course, there's an added layer of complexity of that, which is that there's some places which would fit the model of what you'd expect, but then don't produce a problem. And the interesting
that's
example,
great.
Yeah,
that's great, because then you can study that and you can say, so what happened there? And you know what tends to happen? In one way or another, there are many ways this can happen, but there, by definition, there's some type of resilience. And so it's great when that happens, because then you can say, hey, wait, here's a place that shows a whole bunch of the same factors that this other place had with it, but they haven't. So what's resilient within these communities, within this area? And that's resilience is a theme I get to in the paper that we certainly here in the United States need a lot more of, because we're not going to stop all terrorism, and politicians need to stop talking that way. And Americans need to be a little more comfortable with the fact that you walk out your house, you're probably not going to get hit by a car, but you could. And we still drive our cars. Right. Your kid's probably not going to get shot in a school shooting, but they send the kids to school anyway. Even there's lots of school shootings, a much bigger problem than the terrorism problem in terms of wounded and dead here in the United States. We're going to have to wrap our heads around the fact that you could walk out your house and get killed in a terrorist act. You're probably not going to. In fact, you're almost certainly not going to. It's more likely to get hit by lightning. So we need to put this in its context. And that's hard, because terrorism by definition is psychological. It terrorizes us, and that's why it's different. We need to make it a little less different.
So I'll turn back to the questions. And Norita, one of our colleagues here at ICPVTR, has come up with a question, bringing it back a bit to the region of Southeast Asia. And she thanks you for your refreshing overview of the thinking in the US. You said that there's a broad consensus in the US to decrease American overseas military footprint and these counterterrorism wars. What does this all fundamentally mean for the US CT presence in Southeast Asia and their strategies towards here in terms of US engagement or partnerships on the ground in countries like the Philippines and Indonesia? The US is already to some degree seen as disengaged from Southeast Asia in recent years. Do you think this trend is going to persist further? So how does all these big questions you're talking about and thinking about impact in the Southeast Asian context in particular, where there is a persistent threat from terrorism? We've just seen attacks in Indonesia very recently. It's sort of been, and in Philippines, there's a sort of constant pattern. Your question about enablers and supporting kind of local capabilities and taking the lead as well. How does that kind of fit into Southeast Asian context, and how do you project that looking forwards?
So the US has some great partnerships in Southeast Asia, and our Southeast Asian partners have some real need for some of the capabilities we bring to the table. Under this type of a rethinking of counterterrorism, that doesn't have to end. You know, I argue in the paper there are going to be times when you're in this, you know, gray zone that's not peace but not war, and you could make a difference, and you should deploy small numbers and not permanent. You know, if you look at the way the U.S. military has partnered with the government of the Philippines, one could argue that that is a model that's worked, where the Philippines are taking lead, small number of U.S. forces, primarily in training capacity and support, coming forward a little more when there have been things like Western hostages, but fairly inexpensive, fairly small, fairly safe in terms of the risk to U.S. forces, helping key allies, and like I said earlier, it's currency, right? When the Philippines says, you know, what do they want from the United States? This is going to be a top thing they're going to want. And maybe this is going to be something that's worth it for the United States to do, whether or not we see this as a big threat to the homeland, because we can, because it's the right thing to do, and because it's currency that we can then ask the Philippines to do things with us, maybe on China, for example. So I don't think that it's going to be this kind of complete, you know, bye-bye. I think that the era of kind of massive Afghanistan, Iraq style long deployments, people want that to end. What I also think, however, is that it could be that, you know, someone says they really want the United States to do a whole bunch of things. The United States says, you know, we're happy to help you, but you guys take lead. Maybe the regional power to take more lead on these things now should be Australia. A whole lot closer to that than we are. Maybe Australia has some of the capabilities that the United States has had. Maybe that should be kind of something Australia should be thinking about, and maybe we'll focus on some things that are similar, closer to home. You know, this is not going to be a complete withdrawal from all things counterterrorism, right? The U.S. is still going to help its partners, right? But this massive, long, super expensive deployments, these are going to end. But I've argued that what we've done in the Philippines, what we've done to help Operation Barkhane in the Sahel, and even what we're doing in Syria is very, very different.
Thank you. I mean, I suppose then the dilemma becomes that, you know, the sort of the light approach, or the sort of partner enabled, has gotten into issues in the past. And I think of the effort in Libya, which was intentionally to be led by the Europeans. And I think there's questions about whether that was followed through in the sort of appropriate way. Or even if we look to the Sahel, what you've been talking about a lot, you know, the death of Idris Deby, you know, potentially really changes the kind of dynamics there. And, you know, you would, at that point, you do need a kind of strong American partner. I guess the question becomes, if there isn't one, does that suddenly leave a gap? And that gap, you know, and the catch-up time between filling that gap, what happens in there, I suppose, becomes a bit of a challenge.
But the flip side is, you know, it's not that there's not an American role in Operation Barkhane. It's just that we're not leading it. Mm-hmm. Maybe in a moment of crisis like this, the U.S. needs to step up a little more. I think the other thing we need to talk about, which is another big theme in the paper that we didn't get to here, is, you know, in a lot of cases where the U.S. is going to be extremely involved in counterterrorism, it's just not going to be a military involvement. Right? Diplomacy is not a bad word. There's a lot of counterterrorism diplomacy that can be done that can go a long way. That counterterrorism diplomacy can also help things like guide dollars, like the US's Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, which is run by the State Department and is specifically looking to do counterterrorism capacity building, but not the type that people mostly think of, which is military, mill to mill. This is civilian counterterrorism capacity building. So for counterterrorism investigations, prosecutions, prison systems, counter-radicalization programs, all these basic things. You capture somebody, but then you don't have the ability to incarcerate them properly. You don't have the ability to prosecute them properly. You don't have the ability to put together the case properly. There's a tremendous amount of civilian counterterrorism capacity building, which also, by the way, can be very effective in terms of, let's call it soft security sector reform, that can be very effective. And the US, I argue, should significantly pick up its pace in terms of what it does there. Counterterrorism is not all about the military.
Thank you. A very important point. To go back to the questions, another one of our colleagues at RSIS from SENS, another of our centers, Cameron, has asked, the US has strongly advised nations to repatriate its citizens from the camps in northeastern Syria, and the US, I think, has done a pretty good job of repatriating and trying or dealing with its particular nationals there. But the governments in Europe in particular, and also in Australia, have been reluctant, to say the least. How do you see this playing out going forwards? And I'll maybe build a bit on Cameron's question and say, both in terms of how do you think this is going to get resolved? And two, how much do you think this is going to drive a future threat scenario as well? Or do you think that aspect of it is potentially overplayed or not? So I'm kind of building a bit on Cameron's question, but yeah, over to you.
Yeah. So let me start with the second part first to give some context. This threat is not being overplayed, it is being underplayed. We are kind of passively watching now as a much, much, much more dangerous radicalization, recruitment, training, life experience is developing in places like Al-Hol and the other camps, that dwarfs many times over the size of what happened in the training camps in Afghanistan during the Afghan Civil War and the jihad against the Soviets in the Civil War that followed. The US intelligence community does these forecasting, unclassified forecasting studies. They just released their latest Global Trends 2040. It's available on the ODNI website. I strongly recommend it, but you might want to read it with some alcohol because it's very, very depressing. Each scenario is more depressing than the last. I participated as an outside academic. I had left government in the last one, Global Trends 2030. And it's amazing how many of the worst case scenarios have come to fruition. But even then, and certainly if you look at the new one now, and you think about problems of mass migration, forced migration, problems of food and water scarcity, environmental challenges of the type that we're seeing in Africa, which is leading to conflict, humanitarian crisis on top of natural crises. These are massive problems that feed on themselves, causing, in a term that was used in the last report, and I noticed they use it in this report too, looming disequilibria. Disequilibrium, imbalance looming over the horizon. So I see kids brought up without true education, living out of tents, without shelter, real shelter, without a good diet, not angry. I see this as a massive, massive problem. The fact that the majority of these people are Syrian and Iraqi citizens means that the first part of the question isn't even relevant to all of the problem, but it's hugely relevant and it's an important question. The US has done a pretty good job here. We've been able to do a pretty good job because we've had fairly small numbers. There's still something to be said for being an ocean apart. And I understand the concerns that many countries that have balked at repatriating their citizens have, including over things like lack of evidence to be able to convict them, as of yet unreformed judicial systems that still have fairly short, sometimes very short sentences, even when you do convict someone on a terrorism charge. So it's difficult to convict them if you can at all. And even if you do, they're going to be out in a short period of time. What do we do with these people? I understand, but this is a problem that has to be dealt with. There will be, Russia and others will make sure that there will be no international tribunal. If there were to be one anyway, it would take a very long time, but there won't be. The default has been let the Iraqis run it how they run it, which is not exactly in, let's just say, Western style rule of law. 17-minute hearings ending in death sentence after death sentence. That's not solving the problem. It's creating more angry people in their family. So I think that this is a problem that has to be solved. It has boggled my mind that the international community has been so slow to react. We could, at a minimum, for example, at very, very little cost, improve the living conditions, and we haven't. This is something that needs to be solved, and my fear is that people are all too comfortable looking the other way. And the reason, I think, is quite clear. It's political. I've had very, very frank private conversations with a lot of people who are point people for their various governments on these issues. And it's quite clear that at the end of the day, this is a political decision, and politicians want to get elected. And if people fear that you're letting in dangerous people, that can be difficult. But we have, we focus so much on the battlefield defeat of the Islamic State that we neglect the fact that it's still very much alive and kicking, if not, even if it's mostly in other places than it was as a quote unquote state. And we ignore the fact that there are a significant number of very angry, radicalized people who are in untenable conditions.
Thanks for that. No, I agree. It's I'm been involved in a few conversations back in Europe about this, and it's really irritating to me how they just won't kind of move. Even on repatriating some of the kids, where you're talking about very young kids who are, as you point out, being brought up in a situation which is not conducive for, frankly, their good well-being, into growing up into anything. And in a context where you've got radicalized people all around them, it just seems like a recipe for disaster. Kumar's asked another really interesting and big question. I want to come to that in a minute, but before, I actually want to pick up on a strand here that we haven't really maybe talked about much, but it's something that in ICPVTR we end up looking at a lot, which is rehabilitation and CVE and countering violent extremism. And it's something that here in Singapore, they've got this very developed program of the Religious Rehabilitation Group, which works engaging with sort of individual cases. And I think it's had a pretty good track record of turning people around. There are a couple that just sort of haven't, and it's sort of present, but it's a program that's been operating for some time, and I think it's constantly adapting. And now it's finding itself having to adapt to the new threat context as well. And it kind of brings up the question of, what have we learned over these past 20 years about countering violent extremism, sort of getting ahead of the threat from that perspective, then also rehabilitation. And I know this wasn't a focus maybe all over the paper, but you touched on it a little bit. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned there and where you think, had there really been experiences learned? Because so often I find in some of these conversations, in particular back in Europe, for example, people say, well, we just haven't figured out how to do this. We just don't know how to do this. We've been hitting our heads against a brick wall for 20 years, and we're still dealing with the problem of guys going to prison, coming out radicalized. How do we break that kind of cycle? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of CVE side of this entire conversation.
I very much appreciate that. I run a CVE working group of about, it's upwards of 650 CVE practitioners around the world now. And we hold the meetings once or twice a week. and we've been thinking through these things in a lot of great detail. There's a lot of research now. It's just not intellectually honest to say we don't know. It's also intellectually honest. We got to admit there's also a lot of kind of, kindergarten research that is dressed up to be serious research. We need to start asking ourselves some very, very difficult questions. What do we really want to achieve? Do we want people to stop thinking radical, extreme, sometimes dangerous thoughts? Do we therefore want or insist on de-radicalizing them? Is it sufficient for people to be disengaged? If we think about the spectrum of activity, I think it's fair to say that if we could de-radicalize people, and that would be ideal. But I think what's also accurate that in the first instance, what we really want to do is disengagement, right? And hopefully, if you can, get someone disengaged, no longer mobilized to want to actively do something violent, you also then have an opportunity over a period of time, and these things take time, to work on the de-radicalization. I think we also need to recognize that we used to say that this whole field, CVE, has been overly securitized. There's truth to that, but I think it's something much, much more. We have approached this as a security and a counterterrorism problem. And failure to do so has been seen in many circles as being weak. We need to recognize that a huge portion of this problem is a public health problem. Not only because public health includes all kinds of security issues. Here in the United States, public health includes, gun violence and other things. Public safety is a public health issue. But because, again, there are so many factors that lead people to having that cognitive opening to dangerous ideas, and the vast majority of those are public health issues. Some are mental health issues, not all, but there's no hard numbers, but my strong sense is that if you could have the percentage of cases where the first instance issue is about belonging and purpose and identity, and people searching for those things and finding them in communities that have a purpose that is also violent, explains a lot. We have had some presentations in our working group where people are comparing the radicalization processes we've been studying for a very long time within Islamist circles, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, others, and then comparing them to right-wing extremists in particular. Left-wing, I argue, is a little bit less of a problem in numbers. Certainly in the United States it is, but also left-wing radicalization tends to be very different. Tends to be much higher educated. It's slightly different, not always, but it's slightly different circumstances. But if you compare the Islamist radicalization to the right-wing radicalization, the parallels are mind-boggling. And if you think, for example, here in the United States, about the significant number of US military being demobilized, coming back from traumas of war, and looking for that camaraderie that they had in their unit, not having anymore, feeling most comfortable in a kind of militant setting because they were soldiers, looking for a purpose. They were part of something. They were a small piece, but they were part of something and had a mission. Where's my mission? What's my goal? What am I to do? What's my unit? Who am I with? And a lot of these people came from broken homes or one thing or another. So much of this has nothing to do with terrorism if you really want to get ahead of it, even as a counterterrorism problem. And again, I've upset some of my former colleagues at the FBI and elsewhere. I've told them, at the end of the day, you want to get ahead of the terrorism problem. It's not a matter of hiring more agents and more analysts and more officers. hire more mental health professionals, hire more clinical social workers, and get out in communities and make sure that people are properly integrated. We make fun of our foreign allies sometimes when they use terms like social cohesion, but it's true. And where you don't have social cohesion, you're going to have problems. And when you kind of overlay that on top of the information revolution, and now especially social media, where everybody's opinion is equally valid and there is no truth, then the person who is most appealing to you and with whom you feel most comfortable, their truth is the truth. So a big piece of counterterrorism, yeah, we got to deal with Al-Hol, we got to deal with the ongoing threats, we got to deal with but we have to get ahead of the problem. And so if I were in charge, I would have a group that's focused on the issue of keeping us safe today. I'd have a whole different group, and I'd have them well-resourced to focus on the societal issues that are creating the circumstance in which large numbers of people, for whatever ism, for whatever ideology, find meaning and purpose and belonging and identity in something other than the democratic system, something so different than the democratic system that it involves violence against others.
Thank you. No, I getting ahead of the curve like that, the kind of the CVE side of it is critically important. I mean, I think the resource question you touched on a few times is always a really interesting aspect to look at with it. And again, if I think back to the British kind of experience, it was always fascinating is in the UK, of course, we've got the famous 4-pillar system, and prevent is the kind of the forward-looking part that we're talking about here, about how do you get ahead of the curve and the sort of rehab component. And actually prevent spend is less than 5% of the overall counterterrorism budget, which I think reflects the fact that there really isn't the allocation of resource in that direction. I can understand why, but I think that's really a question that I think a lot of counterterrorism sort of strategies maybe don't necessarily grapple with. Why is it we don't spend more on that side of it, but we spend so much more on the kind of response side, whereas actually maybe you could do saving if you spent more there up front to deal with this
got to convince people to spend today for tomorrow's problem. And I got to say, my friends in the UK, they get hit a lot over prevent and contest more broadly, and it's had its pitfalls for sure. But I tell people here, I have tremendous respect for the UK for trying and failing. Mm-hmm. And I have tremendous frustration that in the United States, our system has no tolerance for that. Mm-hmm. So we don't try unless we're sure we're going to succeed, and then we still don't sometimes. But part of this is going to be some informed experimentation. And maybe some of the failures in the UK case shouldn't have happened, but still, I give the Europeans in general, Singapore program is another good example, a lot of credit for trying sometimes risky stuff, informed, with caveats and safeguards, but and we don't.
It's a no risk threshold. We've got Kumar has asked another really interesting question, which I'll put to you now, which is years ago in the Pentagon's new map, Tom Barnett suggested there could be a Leviathan force to do the heavy fighting in conflict zones and a systems administrator force with allies to engage in institution building and secure a sustainable peace after the fighting ends. And this is something that really struck Kumar. And I think his question is, how were these ideas received back then? And do you think a policy window is opening for a similar type of balanced approach in which kinetic force is better integrated with a kind of good governance enhancing policies in various conflict zones of concern? And picking up on your idea of thinking about enhanced global fragility and how to manage it, could this kind of be a model? And is this kind of a model that you see the US maybe turning back to? And how was that kind of received at the time?
No. I think that when an American foreign policy expert hears institution building, they cringe. Right? We tried, didn't try so well, failed pretty good. We're not about institution building anymore. And we're not about fixing everyone else's problem. So I think you're going to see a big move towards this global fragility type of focus, where we can, primarily not directly through NGOs, we're going to try and move the needle on core factors that clearly lead to fragility. That can be governance issues and corruption issues. It can be access to food and water issues, environmental issues. But I think that the Leviathan fourth, I mean, that's over. That's the whole idea of this. It is over. Where we need to defend ourselves, we're going to do it. But we're going to be a lot more focused on huge state to state, interstate conflict issues that we are realizing we're behind on. Where your question really is going to get complicated, because it's an excellent question, is when we are dealing with states that are human rights abusers, deeply corrupt, but are important because of their counterterrorism contributions, because of their contributions in regional or great power competition. It's not that this is new. The balance is going to change somewhat. And I think the Biden administration is going to struggle with this a little bit. So there's a very clear push within the administration and the Democrats in Congress on Saudi Arabia, after a long list of Saudi missteps and some pretty gruesome things from Khashoggi in particular, but bringing Hariri in and the people being put under house arrest at the Ritz-Carlton, and and of course Yemen. But what happens with Egypt? What happens with Iraq is very unstable. Iraq is considered to be an important interest. Not everything's great there. You can look in other regions, in your region too, and look at examples where Philippines or elsewhere, where the government is taking a particular tack, and that's uncomfortable. And how we balance that is going to be a real challenge.
No, I think it's going to be a really difficult set of issues to tackle. And I think the point about the partners and which partners you're going to have to continue to engage with to try to manage these sorts of threats, I think it's going to be a key part of it. But I wonder if I could build a little bit on that particular point about states and partners, to look at the sort of adversary side, and a bit to sort of talk about the intersection of the kind of interstate conflict and terrorist threats. And I think about that through the lens of proxy groups and manipulation of networks. And I think, I know you've done a vast amount of excellent work on Hezbollah in particular. So looking at the way Iran uses these networks around the world, and their networks that really are global, have had an impact out here in Southeast Asia as well. And if we look at, and I know we've had some other discussions thinking about Russia and how Russia kind of intersects with the right-wing threat in some ways that we see certainly in Europe and in the United States as well. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that side of the threat and how that's going to either complicate. And then the other side of it is, of course, none of this is actually that new. I mean, Hezbollah, as you know well, is an organization that's been around for a very long time. And so the idea of states manipulating these sorts of groups to try to launch attacks is not entirely new in itself. But has it increased at all? And has it increased in line with this sort of great global power competition that we're seeing? Or is it just sort of been constant and we're just noticing it a bit more now because it's coming a bit more prominently? I wonder if I could sort of pull you out a little bit on that side of the question of how the sort of CT threats and response intersects with the global power dynamics in particular. And then, sorry, the final twist I'll add on this one, which is just a curiosity, which I'm particularly struck by, is the US's decision to delist the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which was done under the under the Trump administration. And that of course has angered the Chinese no end. And there is a Uyghur militant threat that does exist, and whatever we want to call them, they are there. And in a way, it's sort of an interesting twist on this whole discussion that the US is now backing away and saying this group, well, never really existed, and therefore we're not going to do it. So I wonder if you could talk about the sort of many layers of this side of the particular problem. And then, I'll give colleagues one last minute if they want to drop any questions in, because we are coming to the end of our time, and I'm conscious that, Matt, it's getting quite late there, and I'm sure you've got a bottle of whiskey just on the horizon that's staring at you, waiting to be cuddled before bedtime. So I'll put it out if anyone has any final questions they want to throw in. I'll maybe take one more if someone drops one into the Q&A. Otherwise, Matt, over to you to talk about this interstate CT threats intersection. Thank you.
First of all, that single malt idea is definitely going to be acted upon. Thank you for bottom of page 6 on the report. Interstate strategic power competition is more and more manifest in the use of militant and terrorist proxies. And it's not just a question of kind of Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah and the Iraqi Shia militants, but think, for example, of Russian mercenaries fighting in Libya with Russian government logistical support. Think about the Russian government recruiting Syrians to go fight, or Turks to go fight in Libya or other places. Reports of Russia offering bounties for Afghan militants who kill US troops. Separatist rebels in the Ukraine using advanced weaponry they received from Russia, or beyond the kind of big obvious cases of Hezbollah, think of the Houthis, who behave as an Iranian proxy, but they are not, like Hezbollah, kind of complete followers of the Waliyat al-Faqih, the rule of the jurisprudence. They have their own thinking. And by the way, as it gets to the issue in Ukraine, I mean, wrap your head around this, right? When it gets to the right-wing extremist element, we have right-wing extremists from closely aligned, sometimes the same groups here in the United States. Some go to fight with the Ukrainians against the Russians. Some fight with the Russians against the Ukrainians, because there are right-wing groups that are very close in the spectrum on each side of that border. So it's absolutely the case, I think, that proxy warfare has picked up. And it's not just the US has supported proxies in Syria, the SDF, and YPG. It's caused a lot of angst with Turkey. The Saudis and others have. I think that this is becoming a way to operate in the gray zone, right? Where there's less likelihood of whiplash and flashback on you, the sponsor. It's a little safer. It's a little farther removed. To that end, many commentators have said, that Shia or Sunni, Iran will happily fight to the last Arab. And I think that that's the case for others as well. The issue of the delisting of the East Turkmenistan Islamic movement is a very interesting case. It wasn't entirely clear on the substance that ETIM was a functioning group when it was listed. I don't think that's why it was delisted. I think this was a piece of lever on China. Then you had the issue of the listing at the end of the Trump administration and delisting at the beginning of the Biden administration of the Houthis. I think it's important to note, as someone who used to work on sanctions and listing individuals and organizations, that designation is only one tool. There's no law in the United States that says if something is determined to be terrorist, you have to designate them. Nor is it the case that if you take them off the list, you suddenly don't consider them terrorists. It's just for the purposes of that list. Delisting the Houthis was not because anyone was saying the Houthis are not engaging in terrorist activity. By any definition, the Houthis are engaged in terrorist activity. But listing them as a foreign terrorist organization was going to risk a massive exacerbation of famine, which was not in the interests of anyone. I do think that the Trump administration was trying to play a little bit of hardball on something that was kind of an easy issue for them. Trump is strong on terrorism, so he could do this. It's not the way I would have done it. I would like to think that even when we're not agreeing on certain things, we can find ways to work together on others. certainly that's going to be the approach on intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear program, these types of negotiations. Terrorism should be something that is a matter of shared concern. I fear that that won't necessarily be the case, and proxies are going to become even more favorable because it costs a lot less money and the risks are much, much less. So rather than go head to head with US aircraft carrier, between China and Taiwan, there are other ways to put pressure. Some of those, in the case of China, won't be militaristic at all. They'll be economic or otherwise. But I do think that this, as a factor of great and near power competition, is going to increase. And I think one of the reasons is just because we haven't successfully raised the costs of doing it. It proves to continually be effective. And so I think we need to really think long and hard about how we raise the costs for that. And I think the example of what's happening in Lebanon right now is a telling one of some of the risks, what happens when you allow a group like this to establish too firm a root in a country and effectively take down the rest of the country with you.
Thank you for that, Matt. I think a very salutary reminder of the dangers. And I think the China point in particular, I think, is one that I suspect resonates in the region, where, of course, one will worry that you'd see that kind of proxy activity being deployed or being used, that kind of proxy clashing, because of the great Chinese interest that you kind of got across the region. So I think that is going to be a real dilemma. I mean, China is a huge topic of conversation, as you can imagine here, in many different ways. I don't think it's going to this direction, but one could see it. And I think that's, it's a worrying potential side to the threat that I think we have to pay attention to going forwards. And I think your memo does an excellent job of sketching a lot of these questions out from a US perspective. I think is a really refreshing look at, what's been happening over the past 20 years and what lessons have been learned. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us this morning, our time. I've just reposted the report in the chat. So if anyone didn't get a chance to see it when Matt posted before, you have it there now. Do download it, do have a read. It's a really excellent piece of work that really does capture, as I say, a lot of the lessons learned. I think Matt's been really generous with his time here this morning, our time, evening, your time, sketching these out in greater detail and putting some more sort of flesh and meat on some of the really interesting points that you made. And one can only hope that, these memos are getting read in US government and they're actually going to input and action some of the ideas that you lay forward. Thank you very much again for staying up into your evening. I think you've deserved your scotch before bed. It's a little early for us here, I think, in the morning to be getting into that, though, maybe I'm tempted if it starts to rain in the sort of monsoon style it does tend to here in Singapore. Thank you all very much for taking the time to join us this morning. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we've recorded this, so we'll be posting it on the ICPVTR RSIS website later, and we'll share that link around, and please have a look and share it afterwards. Matt, thank you again for taking the time, and we very much hope that we'll be able to see you out here in Singapore. I had realized that you were on the board of ICPVTR, and I apologize for not flagging that up earlier, but it's wonderful that you're able to take the time, and very much looking forward to seeing you out here when normality returns and we can all travel once again. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you at the NET discussion. And Matt, I look forward to seeing you somewhere around the world sometime soon. Thank you again.
Same. Thanks so much for having me.
Good evening. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone else.